The Resident Evil franchise managed to redefine the whole horror gaming world exactly 3 times. First with Resident Evil in 1996, which created the whole survival horror trend in the first place, then a second time with Resident Evil 4 in 2005, resulting in a grim decade full of barely horror action horror titles, and then again, most recently, with Resident Evil 7 and the Resident Evil 2 remake, that almost single-handedly brought back survival horror. It's pretty much unthinkable to even doubt that Resident Evil is not by far the most influential horror game franchise we have ever seen. So why am I doing exactly that? Why do I bring up the question whether Resident Evil's biggest, albeit fairly distant rival, Silent Hill, can challenge IE's influence? After all, it was literally created by Konami's greed to get their very own Resident Evil, and they also seem to follow every trend it sets. No matter if it's the survival horror in the early years of the franchise, or the action-oriented disasters in the early 2010s that literally killed the franchise, or even the recent revival with the Silent Hill 2 remake. It's always just Resident Evil does and Silent Hill follows. So yeah, why am I doing this? Simply because it's not that easy. Silent Hill is a lot more influential than most people realize, and I want to find out if it's maybe even up there with Resident Evil. Even if it's just to a certain degree. Of course, it's without any question that Silent Hill took a lot of inspiration from Resident Evil, so that doesn't necessarily help with its case. If we just look at the first Silent Hill, we've already got a very similar gameplay loop and feel, including the controls, combat, function of the enemies, resource management, puzzles, key item hunt, camera angles, and the whole progressing through different dungeon stuff. Sure, there are some small differences here and there, like the ability to move while shooting, the removal of a limited inventory, and the much harder puzzles, but it's very easy to recognize how the foundation of the first Silent Hill is extremely alike to the Resident Evils of that time. This trend also never really stopped, even to this day. All the Team Silent games follow the same Resident Evil-like basics, or rather just follow the same survival horror basics Resident Evil perfected and brought to mainstream. Then the Western developers tried to bring more action, the over-the-shoulder camera and QTEs, just like Resident Evil 4, and now Bloober was heavily influenced by the Resident Evil 2 remake again. Admittedly, there is the occasional outlier, which is often just a spin-off, but Resident Evil has that as well, especially if we consider how they reinvent the series almost every decade, and then the first game of this reinvention is basically an outlier itself until the next few games that follow the same concept make it less unique. Anyway, what I wanted to illustrate so far, and maybe you have noticed, is how Silent Hill's foundation is similar to Resident Evil, but everything on top of that is not only vastly different, but also exactly the hugely innovative part that might be able to compete with Resident Evil's influence. But let me explain. Resident Evil is filled to the brim with action and action characters. The explosions, large weapon arsenals, cheesy one-liners, absurdly enormous bosses, which are obviously always defeated, characters constantly survive unrealistic situations, and of course, it almost always ends with a beautiful flight into the sunset. At this point, these elements are an integral part of those games, be it in large quantities when the game is action focused, or in smaller quantities when the game is horror focused, but always there. Well, and Silent Hill is a complete opposite. I mean, you could literally not be further away while being still in the same ballpark of games. And it has been like that since the very first moment. Already Silent Hill 1 and later 3 were outright terrifying with their visuals and soundtracks, while also having some very impactful and depressing story beats. Silent Hill 2, although not as outright scary as the other two games, told arguably one of the most depressing stories in horror games ever, while creating a world and atmosphere that practically drowned you in dread. Silent Hill 4 had ghosts and burping enemies. No, but seriously, it's important to remember that such horror games simply weren't the standard until Silent Hill showed how much deeper those games could go than just scary zombies. I mean, literally the reason today such horror games are nothing special anymore, along with the term psychological horror games, is largely due to Silent Hill's impact. Team Silent showed that horror games could affect you in much more ways than some simple scares or some tension because you're running low on resources and haven't saved in a while. Because now, those games were experiences that had you tear up for the characters' fates, or seriously question some of your morals and values, or made you deeply terrified by your own headphones because you're hearing the reincarnation of f***ing Satan. On top of that, even though not quite as dramatic, there are also quite a few tropes Silent Hill made mainstream, like the whole town is an own entity concept, or the whole missing and or dead wives and message thing that we've seen over and over again in plenty of horror games in the past 20 years. Nevertheless, I understand if you're still a bit critical about this being enough to reach the levels of influence Resident Evil has had on the horror world, so I brought some examples that show the reach of Silent Hill's impact. Signalis and Tormented Souls. Despite that both of those relatively recent indie releases borrow a lot from Resident Evil's survival horror structure, just like Silent Hill does, the influence it has on both games is obvious. The enemy designs, including the accompanying ear-piercing audio for them, are clearly inspired by it. I mean, Signalis even has a radio. Both feature very cryptic puzzles that are much more like to Silent Hill than Resident Evil. Tormented Souls outright copies the other world, and Signalis covers some rather controversial topics similar to Silent Hill. Of course, both games are meant to be reminiscent of the old survival horror games, so some similarities are a given, but I'd argue it speaks for Silent Hill's influence that those don't just rely on what Resident Evil has to offer, but rather opt to take a lot of inspiration equally from both franchises, just like many other indie survival horror games do as well in recent years. Layers of Fear and The Medium by Bloober Team. I think it's widely known that they are massive fans of Team Silent's work, especially since the Silent Hill 2 remake, so I'd argue there's no better way to show its impact than an entire game studio that builds its whole catalog on games inspired by the psychological horror elements Silent Hill made popular. Especially those two titles are very similar to everything that Silent Hill has to offer, except the survival horror gameplay, since they focus entirely on the psychological element. That means that the presentation, atmosphere and story topics are all almost taken out directly out of Silent Hill, including Akira Yamaoka, to make games that consist of literally nothing else than exactly that. And while some people may dislike certain consequences of those decisions, like the walking simulator nature of those games, in my opinion they perfectly show that Silent Hill's influence can work well even if you leave out the Resident Evil/survival horror DNA. Now to give you one last example to show Silent Hill's reach, here's Alan Wake. Obviously it's a lot more mainstream and not quite in the same genre, but it still offers a similar setting with the town is an own entity concept. The start of the game, including the basic story premise, is basically a mix of multiple Silent Hill games. Obviously the fog and a few characters are basically the same. I think this title in particular just truly demonstrates how Silent Hill's impact is much broader than one might think at first. Sure, most games influenced by it aim to be either very psychological or survival horror based, like my previous examples are, but they don't have to be. So now, is Silent Hill as influential as Resident Evil? Yeah, kinda, but you have to be precise. Of course, Resident Evil absolutely shaped the whole survival horror genre in the first place, reinvented itself multiple times, and changed the industry more often than most people change their underwear. And of course, Silent Hill never had that level of mechanical impact, but it created something equally or almost equally important. An entirely new, psychological, symbolic and emotionally driven type of horror games we didn't have before and wouldn't even have now in the same sense. So in my opinion, even though Resident Evil had by far the most influence on how horror games play like, Silent Hill had more influence on how horror games feel and how they make you feel like, making this comparison rather about what you value more and not about direct facts and numbers. Because then Resident Evil clearly wins and then this video doesn't make any sense anymore. Anyway, without them both, horror games would look drastically different today, so yeah. But what do you think about this topic? Can Silent Hill rival Resident Evil's influence? Yes or no? Please let me know in the comments. Apart from that, I would appreciate if you subscribe, like and share the video if you enjoyed it. Thank you very much and see you next time!